In this section, we're going to look at 4 different sources of fuel that skeletal muscles will use to create their ATP so they can contract. And then we're going to look at 3 different concepts really quickly. Maximum oxygen uptake, or you may have heard it as VO2 max, which is how much oxygen your body can actually use at a time. We'll compare that to your lactic acid threshold, which you'll see is we'll be making lactic acid the whole time, and then at a certain point, it's going to jump up in its production quite quickly. And as it does that, we're going to be borrowing oxygen from hemoglobin and myoglobin, but we're going to have to pay that back after we're done with our activity. So we'll look at all those concepts. So why do our muscles need energy? Well, remember, about 70% of the energy is going to be used for that myosin ATPase. It's going to be pulling it, detaching it from the actin, and then recocking it as it gets hydrolyzed into ADP plus inorganic phosphate. So that's where 70% of the energy is going. The other 30% is going to be used in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or specifically that terminal cisternae, where we're using ATP to pump calcium back in there against its concentration gradient. So we'll have a big concentration of calcium inside that terminal cisternae, so that when the action potential comes down that T-tubule and excites these calcium releasing channels, that the calcium will then be able to flood out into the sarcoplasm. So you can see that happening right here. So when we look at how we use fuel during exercise, we got to consider the different types of exercises. And I've broken this down into 3 different categories. We have resting or doing mild exercise. In that, we're going to include all of our aerobic activities. So we're using aerobic respiration. We're going to be using our fatty acids a lot with that because those give us our greatest impact for ATP per gram of fatty acid. As you increase the exercise intensity, we're going to be using more glycogen stores. So that's going to be breaking down glycogen into glucose. And when we get into real heavy activities, you're going to see that we're going to use that blood glucose first and any free ATP that's available, along with this phosphocreatine system. So we're going to be looking at all of these different sources of fuel here. You can see how it's kind of related to different types of activity. If we look over here on the left side, you can look at this graph. We've got mild exercise, moderate exercise, and heavy exercise. And this is just showing for shorter periods, and they're kind of clumping these into 0 to 30 minutes of exercise. I don't know how many people can sustain heavy exercise for really 30 minutes of time, but usually this is going to be more like 2 to 3 minutes at a time for heavy exercise. But you can see under heavy exercise, we'll be using that muscle glycogen. In moderate exercises, we're still using that, but not quite as much. We're going to be adding a little bit more of the triglycerides and some of the fatty acids in here. And as we get into mild exercise, which we're using mostly aerobic activity, we're going to be using a lot more of those fatty acids and the triglycerides. As we get into long endurance, you can see, okay, we've pretty much eliminated any ability to use heavy exercise for long endurance times. This is like 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So here you're primarily using those fatty acids, which are giving you your high endurance ATPs. That's that 108 ATP for a 16-chain fatty acid. Remember that, compared to 32 for a glucose and 2 for anaerobic activities. So we've got 4 different sources to get ATP for a muscle contraction. So you got to know these 4. First one is pretty simple. It's any free ATP that's in that muscle. The ATP, once it's made, it can't leave the muscle, so it's locked in there. But the muscle can't store a lot of ATP. So what it actually does is it breaks it down into ADP and takes that inorganic phosphate and stores it somewhere else. And the place it stores it, we've got this phosphate here in creatine phosphate. You may have heard that name before. This creatine phosphate is an anaerobic pathway. It's not using any oxygen, and it's going to be able to, and I'll show you how to do this on the next slide, give up its phosphate group really quickly to make ATP on demand. This only lasts 10 to 20 seconds, but it's the fastest way we can get ATP from a source that's not ATP. Second way is by fermentation. So this is our anaerobic process. It's able to last about 2 to 3 minutes at a time, maybe only 45 to 90 seconds if you're doing moderate or heavy exercise. And in this process, this is how we're going to be making our lactic acid. So we're making our pyruvate. Pyruvate says, oh, we're not using oxygen here. So it moves it on to lactic acid through our lactic acid dehydrogenase enzyme and starts that whole process. And remember, we only get 2 ATPs out of this process compared to our aerobic processes. So cellular respiration, full aerobic, is going to be for activities that are lasting more than 3 minutes at a time, we'll say. We're going to be using glycogen in stored muscle. We'll also be using some of our fatty acids too that I showed in the last slide. Those fats are the slowest. They take the longest because they got to chunk everything down. But again, it's going to give us your greatest bang for the buck. So we'll be using both glycogen and fats in our aerobic cellular respiration. So let's look at these one at a time. First, we got this creatine phosphate pathway. Here we've got our creatine phosphate, and all that it's going to do is it's going to give up one of its phosphates to ADP and make ATP. In that, we're going to be getting creatine out of this. So the creatine is going to actually be made in the liver and in the pancreas and in the kidney. And we also get it from foods that we eat. So a lot of our meats and seafood are going to give us creatine. So people that are vegetarians are going to have to rely on your liver, pancreas, and kidneys are breaking down those foods that you eat and transferring some of those amino acids, because creatine is an amino acid. So it's going to have to break down other amino acids and make them into creatine. When we rest, that creatine phosphate then is going to get replenished. So this creatine will then get a phosphate added to it, and we'll get our creatine phosphate again. We can use supplements. You may have seen these in some of the stores. Most vitamin supplement stores like GNC or different gyms are going to be selling all this creatine powder, and that can be beneficial. I mean, you can increase your muscle phosphocreatine, and that can help you with short-term energy exercises. So a lot of people use that to help build muscle. Long-term use, though, it's been shown it people can have side effects from that. So it can actually cause some damage to your heart, kidney, and liver, especially if you're using it constantly for a period of like 5 years or more, I believe is what they're finding. And people who have diabetes or hypertension or any kind of kidney disease are encouraged certainly to consult their physician, because it will affect that. So here we can just see there's a coupling reaction. We've got our phosphocreatine, and that's going to give up a phosphate group to ADP to form our ATP. On the other end, if you just got the creatine, it's going to take a phosphate off of ATP so that we're not storing ATP in the muscle. So if you make enough ATP and you don't need it, you're going to store it as phosphocreatine. And that ATP is going to be used for our muscle contractions. Creatine kinase is the enzyme that makes all that happen. It's actually kind of interesting. We can use creatine kinase, or we can measure it in our blood. So if you take a regular blood sample, you can actually see if creatine kinase is there. And when it's there, that usually means that something's going on, that muscle tissue has broken down and it's released its creatine kinase. So it's helpful in diagnosing things like myocardial infarctions or heart attacks, where those cardiac muscles are dying and then the creatine kinase is released, or different diseases like muscular dystrophy, or something called rhabdomyolysis, which you probably haven't heard of before. Rhabdomyolysis is basically damage to that skeletal muscle. And you can get that from physical trauma, or you can get it from different drugs and toxins that are going to damage these tissues. And what happens is that creatine kinase is going to leak out into your bloodstream, and then we can measure it there and notice that, oh, something's going on with this individual. Now, what's kind of interesting about creatine kinase is that there's different isoenzymatic forms. So think of it as like different isomers of this enzyme. So we call it an isoenzyme. And you don't need to memorize these names or anything, but I just want you to understand the concept that when we're looking in the blood, we can tell different types of creatine are going to be released from different types of muscle. So skeletal muscle will have this type, CKMM, and heart muscle or cardiac muscle will have CKMB. Again, don't memorize the names, just understand the concepts that we can tell where the disease muscle is based on the type of enzyme of creatine kinase. Okay, so we'll move on to number 2, fermentation. You've already had this. This is our lactic acid fermentation, so it's our glycolysis when we make our pyruvate, and then we're not going to go aerobic process, so we're going to change that into lactate or lactic acid. And that lactic acid will then get recycled via the Cori cycle into our bodies, or into the liver, and be turned into glycogen and then eventually glycose again. There is a term called DOMS, and that stands for delayed onset of muscle soreness. This is what you feel after you work out. So maybe a few hours later to the next day, you wake up and you go, oh, I can hardly move, my muscle's sore. We used to think that that was due to a buildup of lactate or lactic acid, but really we found that that is short-lived, and what you may be feeling is the inflammation from those muscles having to rebuild or getting torn during the workout, and I'm talking about microscopic tears down on the myofibril level, and that's what's going to actually cause the muscles to get repaired and get larger, and we'll go into that in a few more slides. Cellular respiration is the last one that we talked about. So this is the slowest but most efficient, and of course you remember this is all happening in the mitochondria. This is where our pyruvic acid is going to be turned into our acetyl-CoA, and that's going to go through citric acid cycle, electron transport chain, and oxidative phosphorylation to give us our 32 ATPs. And remember, we've also got our fatty acids that are going to turn into acetyl-CoA and go through the same process. So this whole thing requires oxygen, and in the muscle cell, the oxygen is going to come into the muscle cell, and it's going to get held in that muscle cell by myoglobin. Myoglobin is very similar to hemoglobin, except it's just got 2 chains on it, and it holds on to the oxygen much more strongly than hemoglobin does. And that's important because that muscle cell is going to be hot from all the energy it's creating. So it doesn't want to just let go of its oxygen nilly-willy. It's going to hold on to it till it really needs to let it go. So that's one of the advantages of myoglobin in the cell. And then that myoglobin is going to be what's responsible for transporting that oxygen to the mitochondria. Okay, we got 3 concepts to look at here. First one is maximal oxygen uptake. This is also called your aerobic capacity, or looking at your VO2 max, so it's ventilation of oxygen max. And we've actually done this in labs before, where we'll put people on bikes and we'll put a little tube, hook it up to their mouth, so we're measuring all of the air that's going in and all the air that's going out. And this isn't just the volume of air, but it's hooked up to a big computer that actually measures the content of that air. So we know how much oxygen is flowing into this person, and then as they breathe out, you notice their nose is clipped off here, it's going to breathe out through another tube, and that's going to measure how much oxygen is left in that tube. So you can look at the difference and determine how much oxygen their body is actually using. And all that you need to know at this point is that the rate of that oxygen use is called our aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, when you're working as hard as you possibly can and you can't breathe any deeper or faster or longer or use that oxygen anymore. This maximum amount is going to be determined by age, sex, physical size, and athletic training. So usually males and younger people are going to have a higher VO2 max. Males are just typically bigger, have a larger lung capacity. Younger people tend to have healthier lungs. So that's going to both contribute to having a larger VO2 max. The range, I'm not so concerned that you know these numbers, because you'll see On this chart over here, they're a little different than what's in your book, but somewhere between 12 milliliters and 84 milliliters of oxygen per minute used per kilogram of body weight. It's kind of hard to get a concept of that physically in your head, but what I want you to realize is looking at this little graph down here. We've got speed, so this is how fast this person is pedaling around the bike, so it's kind of giving you an idea of work, how hard they're working. And then oxygen utilization. So the harder you work, the more oxygen you're going to start to use up. And what they do is they put these people on a bike for generally a period of 10 to 12 minutes or so. And every small time period, maybe every minute and a half, they're going to increase the resistance on that bike. So they're having to work harder and harder and harder. So by the end, they're kind of doing a maximal workout here. And you can see that as their speed or work intensifies, their oxygen utilization is going to increase until it's going to come to a point where it can't increase anymore. You can't breathe any deeper, you can't breathe any faster, and that blood is not going to, as it's passing by the lungs, it can only absorb so much oxygen at a time. So that's going to depend on, when you're looking at total volume of oxygen, again, your age, sex, physical size, athletic training, and this athletic training is going to go into, well, how many red blood cells do you have? How much hemoglobin do you have available to accept the oxygen that you're breathing in? So it's looking at all those factors. So at some point it's going to plateau. That gives you your VO2 max. On the bottom end, look at this one too. We're going to see this in the next slide. This is our lactate threshold. And what this is showing is that as our speed is increasing, we're slowly increasing the amount of lactic acid that's being produced all the time. And then at some point, when we're kind of struggling a whole lot, before we hit that VO2 max, we're going to start to spike that lactic acid increase. And we're going to start doing a lot less aerobically, and we're going to start ramping up the amount of, at least relatively, the amount of lactic acid that we're producing so we can get those quick energy stores because we're running out of oxygen at that point. So we'll see that on this next slide. So this is the lactic acid threshold if we're looking at this kind of blown up a little bit more. Down here is the amount of lactic acid that we're producing, and in the red is going to be our heart rate. So you can see as the heart rate is working harder and harder and harder, there's going to be a point where we're going to see a little spike in the amount of lactic acid that's being produced. And generally that happens at about 50 to 70% of our VO2 max. You can see that sharp increase. And what we can do with training is that we can actually change the shape of this curve. So if this right here, this dark line is somebody who's untrained athlete, with training, and especially we're talking about endurance type training, we can shift this curve so that at a work rate of, let's say, 325 watts, the athlete may be having a 2.5 maybe millimoles per liter of our lactic acid buildup, compared to an untrained person who's going to be making a lot more lactic acid at that same level of work because they don't have the aerobic capacity to keep going, to stay sustained at that aerobic level. So that's how you can see how this shift curve works. Also, with endurance training, people also think that you can just kind of physically tolerate a higher amount of lactic acid. So if you look at it this way, you can still get to that 10. Here they're a little bit above 10 millimoles of lactic acid. They're working a lot harder to get there, but they can also just physically tolerate the pain of that lactic acid a little bit better. So maybe they can actually end up going up to 12 or 13, somewhere around there, let's say. In our last slide here, we're going to take a look at oxygen debt. And kind of the fancy name for this is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or we're just going to call it EPOC. And basically, when you're exercising, oxygen is going to be taken out of your reserves, and those reserves are going to be our hemoglobin and our myoglobin. And we're going to use that oxygen to make our ATP. And remember, we're going to need that to create our cross bridges in the muscle contraction, to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasm, and to metabolize our lactic acid. Because as you're building up that lactic acid, you're going to need ATP. Remember, I believe it's it costs 6 AT to get that back through the Cori cycle so that you can use it again later on through aerobic respiration. So we need that ATP for all these things. We're going to borrow oxygen from hemoglobin and myoglobin to do that. So that's why after you're done exercising, you still have to breathe pretty heavily. And you're breathing to get that oxygen. Your muscles might not be moving anymore, but you got to replace the oxygen that you've borrowed from that hemoglobin and myoglobin. Remember, hemoglobin has 4 different heme groups on it. So normally we're just taking off 1 oxygen at a time. But as you start exercising really heavily, you may take off a second or possibly even a third. Hardly ever does it get all 4. But you're going to start to go into your reserves a little bit. And so after you're done exercising, that's why you're breathing heavy, to replace that oxygen. If this little benign cat here breathing doesn't do it for you, we've always got our friend Hulk Hogan, who clearly after a very heated fake wrestling match used up a lot of his oxygen stores, and he's trying to replace that now. So I'll see you in the next video, and we're going to talk about different types of muscle fibers.